Ahead and get started. So welcome all and thank you for being here to session 2 of our GLSEN training series, Safe Spaces or Safe Schools, Brave Spaces. And one of the reasons we kind of named that is there's historically GLSEN has what's called a safe space training. But there's a lot of times where individuals, something is shared that maybe cause a little discomfort, and then people go to a place of saying, I don't feel safe. I think we have to be very clear about like feeling discomfort doesn't mean feeling unsafe. And so sometimes we have to be willing to lean into brave spaces and brave conversations. And so, so today is session 2. And so myself, along with the wonderful Shanda Sugg, will be talking through applying a trauma-informed care to the coming out process. And real quick, just want to share that on Monday, to kick off GLSEN Solidarity Week, Monday, October 5th from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m., we'll have a coming out intersectional and going to be exploring stories of individuals who their lives are at the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality. And so next week, so GLSEN historically has had what's called an Ally Week, and this is the first year they've changed that to Solidarity Week, to really think about how we can be for the liberation and justice of others. So, so that is what is coming up on our radar. So cool. So for today's presentation, Shanda and I are going to kind of go back and forth, share some different pieces. Feel free if you have a question as we're going through. We're a small enough group to come off mute, put something in the chat, and then we're going to leave a little time at the end too for just kind of conversation and additional questions and things people might have. So I'm gonna share my screen to kind of start us off. Actually, Shanda, anything? I mean, you want to do a brief introduction? So before we get into the content. And so Shanda Sugg is a past presenter at GLSEN's Youth Summit and has been someone I've had the opportunity to work with for many years. But tell the folks what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Shawn. I'm very honored to be here sharing information with you all. So I am a trauma specializing therapist and trainer and consultant. I do a lot of work with people, helping them understand what trauma actually is, how to understand its impact on our brain and bodies, and then ultimately training people to develop trauma responsive practices so that as they're engaging with people that they're not re-traumatizing them, but actually helping build resilience. So that's one leg of my work. And then I'm a therapist. I have transitioned to focusing exclusively on families, preferably multi-generational families, usually with teenage to older adult children. If you sprinkle in a grandma and an auntie, I get real happy. So I really enjoy working with the whole family dynamic, because the reality is, as much as I value individual therapy, people come to individual therapy with relational issues. So the more people I can get into a space who are in relationship with each other, the more I can help them truly understand what's really happening, because we got to go back to what we've been through impacts how we show up in the world. So that's a lot of the work I do.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us tonight. And for those who I haven't met, my name is Shawn Jeffers. I am a GLSEN volunteer and coordinate our professional development training, and also organize in most years our GLSEN Youth Summit. This year, in lieu of the Youth Summit, we have this training series for adults. And then for young people, since historically the Youth Summit is a great opportunity for them to come together, we've been having programming through our GLSEN youth group that meets every Monday evening. So to start us off today, I want to kind of share a little bit of a story. So a couple years ago, I was asked to do a presentation at Cincinnati State. And one of the things when I do presentations in schools, if possible, love to have a student or a young person present to share their story. And so this was more for faculty at Cincinnati State, and one of the members of their GSA on campus was able to come and kind of share a little perspective. And when he was talking about coming out, he was sharing that the first time he came out was to his mom. And he had done all of these kind of calculations about how it was going to happen. That he was in the car, but was like, wanted to make sure it wasn't too far from home in case mom kicked him out of the car, that he could walk home. And did it at a stop sign because he wanted to make sure the car wasn't driving, and he like, you know, and mom wasn't driving and maybe got like surprised by something and like wrecked the car. And so there was all of these things and all of these worries that are kind of coming up. And I think for so many individuals who come out somewhere along the spectrum as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, what have you, whatever kind of terminology that they come out as, somewhere along that sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression continuum, is that there's a lot of fear that comes around this person who I'm coming out to probably is never going to talk to me again. The reality oftentimes is that, you know, people who we come out to are usually folks in our life who have a relationship or a connection with us and become accepting, but there's still a lot of fear that there's going to be this rejection. And so, so I asked LaShonda to be with us today to kind of be able to share some of that perspective of what goes on sometimes in individuals' minds and brains, so we can kind of understand and navigate that. One thing I just want to like do a little bit of setting on is just kind of helping us make sure we're all clear on like how coming out looks and like some of the settings our young people might be in. I'm going to share my screen here to show a couple pieces. So one, every 2 years, GLSEN comes out with a national school climate survey. If you really love data and this is your like thing, you can go to glsen.org/research and download the full 147-page report and have that be your weekend reading. And the 2019 will be coming out soon. If that is not how you want to spend your time, a couple quick things to kind of highlight. So one, every student who takes this survey identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, or queer, and somewhere in that spectrum. 87% of students routinely hear anti-LGBT language and experience victimization or discrimination at school, which unfortunately doesn't surprise us. Anyone who's ever walked through a school knows that unfortunately there's bullying, there's name calling, you know, harassment, these things kind of happen. But we sometimes write it off as boys will be boys, kids will be kids, this kind of rite of passage, this idea. And one, we just have to really name that like bullying should not be a rite of passage. But like this is something that we have to be thoughtful of. But the other thing is that 55.3% of students said they didn't report to school staff because they doubted anything would be done. And even more surprising or shocking is that 56.6% said they reported hearing homophobic remarks from school staff, and 71% heard negative remarks about gender expression from school staff. So if our students are saying that it's not just kids, their fellow students, that they're feeling not embraced by or not supported by, that it's the adults, then we have to recognize that like that is something as adults that we own part of, you know, being able to like really work on that. And so that is part of our hope. And, you know, as we do this series, as well as recognizing that each of us have opportunities to kind of grow and better support young people. Third piece we just want to kind of be able to highlight is real quickly, what does it look like when folks are coming out? So a couple things just to name is that you do not have to know every term that exists in the LGBTQ+ lexicon. There's a beautiful tool out there called Google. You can Google any of these terms that you are not clear on. But what we do generally need to understand is that when young people are coming out to us, oftentimes it is either because it's somewhere around gender identity, gender expression, or attraction is that they're coming out to us in one of those areas. And so that's really understanding like how we can support. So I'm going to run through some brief pieces around that. If there's anyone in the call who kind of needs a little refresher, and then we'll kind of be able to go a little in depth. But a couple of things to just kind of, as we look at this, just kind of name. One is that even before we're born, identities start popping up for us. Because a person who is pregnant, the question that they get immediately when it's found out they're pregnant is, what are you having? And one time I was doing a training and a woman was like, I didn't really want to like get into it. And so I was just like, you know, somebody was like, kept pressuring her and pushing and was like, what are you having? What are you having? She was like, a baby. She's like, yeah, but what kind? She's like, a human one. And just trying to like not, but it's like this idea of like this aspect. And if you do share that like it's a boy or a girl, or at least that is what the sonogram is like, you know, kind of initially indicating, is that then oftentimes things start to happen. Rooms are painted certain colors, clothes and toys are bought that are certain styles, or they have certain, you know, designs or toys or things on them, you know, names and all these things kind of start to come around, you know, and there's these expectations even before we're born that sometimes happen. But so we just have to say that sex assigned at birth is kind of sometimes that first identity many of us get, is that, you know, when we're born, the doctor makes an assessment of our genitalia, and then that is put on a birth certificate. In Ohio is one of 4 states in the country that you cannot change the sex marker on your birth certificate. There is no way to change that currently with the laws in Ohio. And so that is something that is in the works, but is being, but like does have, you know, dynamics for a lot of folks. That sex assigned at birth. But then we kind of look at gender identity. For gender identity, in stages of childhood development, it's between 2 and 4 years old is when children start to get a sense of their gender identity. And so they might not have the words, like, you know, but it's like there start to be ways that they think, that they express, you know, so gender identity, gender expression starts to kind of show up in some of those ways. And so when we think about gender identity, for many of us, either female, woman, girl, or male, man, boy tend to be the identifiers we use. Some people don't feel like they fit neatly in that binary, so they sometimes, other genders, sometimes that can be trans or non-binary, or genderqueer, gender fluid. There's, as I said, lots of different terms that people might identify with. But for myself, for instance, I was assigned male at birth, and I still identify as male today. And so I would say I'm cisgender, CISGENDER. We're staying on the same side of my gender and sex that I was assigned align. For those folks who that doesn't align, that's sometimes where their gender, their sex assigned at birth, and their gender identity, if there's some transition, so that trans, you know, sometimes that transaction, transition, like there's some movement in that is kind of the idea of where the word comes from when we think about transgender. There's been some shift that has happened for individuals. And so that's just one piece that comes out. One of the things that we sometimes say around when we think about young people and they start to, you know, there's a lot of times where there's young people start that there is, I mean, when young people are coming out, there's a lot of times where it's a thought from adults sometimes, like, is it a phase? Like, is it a phase with what's happening and something like that? So one of the things we kind of say in the coming out process is, are young people consistent, persistent, and insistent? So if I happen to, you know, grow up in a home where there was only like older sisters or something, that maybe there just happened to, these were the toys, these were like kind of things that played. Like, it wasn't that I was insistent though that I needed that. It was just dolls were around, you know, maybe played with them because my sisters had them or whatever. Like, but there's sometimes where there's this like insistence of like, this is what I feel, this is who I am, this is what I need. That some folks are very insistent on. So that's one of the things we just have to acknowledge or recognize when young people are saying, I need, you know, or I feel this way, I need these things, that we're aware of that, you know, that insistence, that persistence, that consistency around how we can help them as they are coming out. So that's kind of some things generally about gender identity. Is it's just how we think about ourselves when we think about ourselves in terms of gender is, you know, is really the simplest way. Then we have gender expression. When we look at our gender unicorn for gender expression, the dots, gender expression is all the things that are visible, that people can see. So it's our hair, our clothes, our mannerisms, our speech, like all these things that are kind of visible or present for others. And so, so for gender expression, you know, kind of on our gender unicorn example here, we have feminine, masculine, other sometimes androgynous, different ways that sometimes people present or show up. And then our last is physical and emotional attraction, sometimes referred to as sexual orientation. But we see here that the physical and emotional attraction, this is who we are attracted to, who we kind of, you know, who we, you know, consider in different ways. And so the physical attraction oftentimes is what we can see. The emotional attraction is oftentimes ways that we connect or feel, you know, with folks. And so a couple things just to highlight this. So one way I've heard it described is gender identity is how we think about ourselves. Sexual orientation or attraction is who we think about. So how do we think about ourselves as identity, who we think about as attraction, just to kind of understand how some of those play out. And one of the reasons this is important is there's a term that a lot of us have probably heard, a slang term that a lot of us have heard. And I'm here to say, if you leave with nothing else from our time together tonight, leave with the knowledge that gaydar is not a real thing. It is made up, it is not real. But the dynamic though of gaydar, it really is also a misnomer that much more it's about gender expression. Because it's, you see somebody how they're expressing themselves, and then you start to make assumptions about aspects of their identities. And so when we think about gender expression, that we have this idea of, you know, this aspect of like, this is what is I can see, you know, times. And part of the reason there's a coming out process is because gender identity is how we think about ourselves. Attraction is who we think about, but both of those are about our thoughts, which is internal. Gender expression is the only one that's visible. So a lot of the identities that people have, if it's lesbian, gay, or bisexual, that's typically more connected to attraction. If it's transgender or non-binary or genderqueer or something along that, that's more connected to identity and, you know, piece. And so oftentimes this idea of, you know, people are not able to, you know, those are not identities that are visible when you first meet someone. So that is one of the reasons why people have to come out. So sometimes there's a question of like, well, why do people even need to come out? And I think particularly for our young people, there's just a whole lot that young people are navigating, and feelings and emotions, and it's just a naturally healthy thing to kind of come out and share. But I want to bring Shanda into the conversation now to kind of, as we kind of give that like overview of the specific questions about terms or things. But wanted to just do a quick overview so we're all on the same page on that. But so Shanda, like in that idea of like sometimes it's like why, you know, sometimes there's this idea of why do young people, well, you know, there's a question sometimes from adults, like why do young people even feel the need to come out? And so just kind of, can you walk us through a little bit of helping understand like that, the ability, you know, to feel belonging and things like that?
Yeah, I was just like, man, there's so much to say because it's so complex. I think I'll start with this idea of reality. And this applies to every single person. Our ability to embrace our humanity and truly be connected to reality starts when we're young. And it's usually fostered by our internal experience being validated from external sources. And so an example I use when I'm training specifically about trauma is I'll say, it's the little kid who comes into the caregiver's bedroom in the middle of the night and says, I'm scared, there's a monster in my closet. And that caregiver says, oh my God, do you know what time it is? Go back to bed. There's no such thing as monsters. So what the adult has done is they've taken this external thing, there's no such thing as monsters, but they haven't addressed the fear, the panic, the increased heart rate, the sweating that's happening for that child. So that child then has to figure out how, if my body is doing this thing I'm calling fear, but everyone outside of me is saying, or maybe not everyone, but the people I trust, the people who are my caregivers to take care of me are saying, there's nothing wrong. I start not to be able to trust my own reality. So think about a child, a young person who, when we talk about, we look at the unicorn and we say how they think of themselves, it's not being affirmed or recognized by outside influences or people who care about them, or they're people they trust. They're not getting a mirror back of how they see themselves. There is a very complicated process of, do I even trust that? Like, am I wrong? What's wrong with me if everything out there is saying I'm not? And so the confusion, even in that, is part of this process of the coming out process. So I now want to segue and talk a little bit about safety. Okay. So as human beings, we are either safe or in pursuit of safety. Every single human being. We're either safe or in pursuit of safety. And if we're in pursuit of safety, sometimes that means we have to fight. Sometimes that means we have to flee. We got to run away. Sometimes it means we shut down. Sometimes it means we find others to gather with. But no matter what it is, we're seeking safety. Now, when we think about it from that perspective, just take a moment to think about how unsafe our culture is for anyone who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender non-conforming. So what do we mean by unsafe? Well, there are different types of safety. There's physical safety. And we know that there is a high rate of violence against people in the LGBTQ community, right? So there is like, am I physically safe if this is my identity? Then there's psychological and emotional safety. Do I get to show up as myself and express myself as I am and be welcomed and appreciated and valued? Oh, I was like, why did my picture get big? Shawn, that scared me. That's okay. It's like, are you still there? So this is part of safety too. Thinking about how I show up in the world. Some of us think about this when we have to pick what outfit we're going to wear because we know we're going to be on a Zoom call, right? But that temporary moment of being cautious and conscious about how I'm going to show up, that is an everyday persistent experience for a lot of young people who have to show up sometimes contrary to who they are and who they feel they are, because if I show up in a different way, regardless of who I'm attracted to, someone is going to say something and I might be unsafe. Then there's social safety. Am I going to be in social environments where my differences and uniqueness is going to be embraced? That's not socially safe. Then there's moral safety. Is it a safe and just environment? Is it fair? So when we just think about various types of safety, I think many of us can even just understand how safe it is to exist in a body of a person who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender nonconforming, or any of that, right? So if they are constantly given messages that it's not safe to exist in this world, and they're either safe or in pursuit of safety, that tells us they're doing a lot of pursuing. And that looks different for different people. So part of the coming out process for a lot of young people, for a lot of people, is finding who's safe. Ist in the little parentheses, because they may not necessarily identify the person they're coming out to as safe, but they may be the safest person that they have. And if you had to think about spending just the next 7 days navigating your world, comparing who's safe, who's not, is this okay? That takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of resources. And so when you find someone that you can be completely open and honest with, man, I think all of us in some way can probably think about something that we've held dear to ourselves that we don't regularly say or tell people. Maybe it's something that was done to us. Really, there's a lot of shame around things that have been done to us: sexual assault, sexual abuse, abuse of any kind, whatever. We hold those things. And if you, like me, have a significant trauma story and you found people that you can unburden yourself with that and just be who you are, there is just a literal settling of being able to do that. I also want to make it clear about this process is that sometimes when our young people find a safe person or a couple safe people to come out to, that doesn't mean that they've come out completely to the world. In Shawn's story, he said the first time he came out, right? Well, if you say the first time, that would indicate that he came out at least one more time, usually numerous times, because there's this constant reiteration of having to be who you are again for the first time, it seems, to different people. Does that not sound exhausting to anybody but me? To have to consistently go through the pattern of showing yourself for the first time to different people in different ways. And so I just wanted to paint a picture that no matter how we identify the human experience of shame and the weight of not feeling safe and seeking safety is a human experience. But it's usually a human experience that is temporary, situational, and we have a lot of other supportive things happening around us that buffers that experience. And that is not always the case for our youth and even adults who are in the coming out process. I wanted to also talk just a little bit about, so we know who we are when we're young because of who people told us we are. How did Shawn know his name was Shawn? Because people kept calling him Shawn. No, it's true. If you have anybody in your family who got called a nickname from when they were really young, these kids get real confused come kindergarten, and they're told to write. I have my niece, she has called her child Pooty, P-O-O-T-Y, since this girl was born. She got to kindergarten, and now when all the teachers and kids are calling her name, she's like looking around like, who is that? Because she's been called a different name her whole life. So we self-identify by how others identify us as the natural progression of development throughout life. What happens at some point, though, is people sometimes give us an identity that doesn't feel authentic to ourselves. So this may be, I'll give a really surface example. You grow up in Ohio and your whole family is Ohio State fans. And so you got scarlet and gray in every room in the house, and you're a Buckeye according to your family. Well, somewhere in grade school, you wise up and realize that the University of Michigan is a far superior school. No, I'm joking. I am a Michigan grad. But you get to a certain point and you're like, wait a minute. I like maize and blue. And I laugh about this example, but y'all know it's real. I've lived in Ohio long enough to know that full family, like, disowning people happens around who you affiliate with and identify with. Thank you, Jessica, in this regard. So at some point, someone says, even though my whole family is a Buckeye and I've been given Buckeye stuff and I'm supposed to like the Buckeyes, I like the Wolverines. But if I share that with my family, some people are going to get really upset with me. They're going to be upset. Maybe I'm disparaging the family legacy. Maybe, all these things. We can, if you grew up in a sports-oriented family, your body may even be responding to some of this as I'm talking about it. And that's just what sport team you like. Now imagine, instead of Buckeye Wolverine. It is legitimately who I am as a person. And everyone keeps telling me that I am supposed to be this way, engage this way, look this way, sound this way. But it's contrary to what I truly believe is who I am. You're surrounded by people that, if I tell them, what if they disconnect from me? Now, let me tell you why that's important. Because as humans, our greatest human fear is disconnection. And that is simply because we're biologically wired to be connected together. If you leave a newborn baby where it's born and there's no outside intervention, within 72 hours, that baby dies. A newborn baby can do nothing for in and of itself to keep itself alive. So our brains and bodies are hardwired to connect and collaborate together, to connect with other people, because literally our survival depends on it as individuals and as a species. When we find ourselves in situations where our brain perceives that we will be othered or rejected or dismissed or isolated, it puts us into survival mode. It releases all kinds of chemicals, cortisol being the main one, which is our stress chemical that moves us into our fight, flight, and freeze. Because the brain is constantly like surveilling our environments to make sure that we're safe. One of those 4 safeties I mentioned before. So imagine the child, the middle schooler, the 9th grader maybe, who has come into a school environment and they are listening very, very closely. They're looking very, very closely for this safety. What are they looking for? How people treat other people who are different in whatever way. What are they listening for? The language that people use, the jokes that people tell. In some regards, I can empathize with this very well, because when I go into different spaces, particularly white spaces, I am looking very closely. I am paying attention to what news outlets you watch, what your social media looking like. I'm paying attention to, media that you're reading. I'm listening to the words you're using. Why? Not because I'm nosy, but because my safety depends on it in a lot of cases. I need to know what kind of words you're using. I need to know what kind of values you got out there that you just kind of real free with it about, so I can start to take note. Okay, that person's not safe. That person's talking to that person and smiling, so by proxy, they ain't safe either. And we're figuring it all out. And the key thing is, it's all underneath our consciousness. We're not consciously aware often that we're doing these things. So when you go back to that GLSEN survey, and 70% of those poor babies said they heard that nonsense coming from educators. And the educators and staff are supposed to be the ones that keep you safe, but they're unsafe. How can you ever go to school and feel safe? And if you can't go to school and feel safe, you can't learn. So if you have someone in the LGBTQ community in school who's coming home with some good grades, I need you to understand how hard that is, because their survival brain is constantly at work, and they found the resilience to use the cognitive part of their brain to learn and take tests and remember information, when so much of it is just surviving in the halls where you hear messages and you see messages that tell you you don't deserve to exist and live. So that's very real. And I could talk for 5 more hours, but I just wanted to give this kind of high level understanding that it's not just things that are happening here during the coming out process. This is a full brain body collaboration of where is my safety? If I don't know where it is, how do I seek it? All the while going through puberty, hormones all out of control. Their brains are not fully developed, the part that is rational. And so it's a lot going on with our young people. And for us to reduce it down to just kind of, oh, they came out, as if it was just some small activity, it's really insensitive to the biopsychosocial experience that this is.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those words. And I think to add a little bit on, like, one of the things that I've heard sometimes from educators, like when I've gone into school, is, like, this student was, just seemed to be like a plain old normal student. And then they came out and now they're, paraphrasing here, but essentially they're now like a one-person pride parade, like, they're everything rainbow. And like, why is that? And I think there just has to be that acknowledgement that, one, you saw a snapshot of what people were willing to show you and beforehand. And so that dynamic sometimes is people are willing to show you bits of themselves. Like, no one is going to always show you everything. And so sometimes people show you a small bit of who you are or what they're willing to, who they are. And so there's sometimes a dynamic that when I come out, if I wear rainbow or if I wear things, I no longer have to come out because it's just, I'm making the invisible visible. And so there's a dynamic around that. I think that we just have to sometimes acknowledge. And I think Shanda really helps us see why sometimes, to avoid some of that brain body, emotion building and bubbling up, why some of that might happen for young people. So I want to give a couple quick best practices, tools to help us understand, and then we'll kind of continue our conversation. I'm going to share again. So a couple pieces to just kind of share. So we've been talking a lot about like what it looks like. So here's some things we're going to encourage people to do in the coming out process. One, and this is the most important part and why we've listed it 3 times, is to listen. How many times has a friend called you and been kind of like, not really had all their words together, stringing them together, and you're just kind of like, all right, well, you figure out what you want to say, and I'm going to talk for a bit, and we'll come back to you. And we sometimes like, so recognizing sometimes that if somebody really seems like there's something that needs to be there, it's got to take a second. Like the first time I came out, it was in college to my ex-girlfriend, Katie, and it was probably about 45 seconds of like, Katie, before I could say the word. Because even though internally I understood that I was attracted to men, saying I was gay felt like it was going to radically change everything about me. Like there was a shift that was going to be happening that was really, that I thought I was ready, but there's a lot of times where saying it out loud is there. So I think that being on the receiving end of that, just seeing that someone needs a space to say, hey, I see you got a lot on your mind. I'm here when you're ready to talk. Just allowing someone just to sometimes sit there. And that when somebody comes out, because of what we've been talking about, there's sometimes a lot of this emotion bubbling up. There's a fear automatically that they're going to be rejected, even though that's not what happened. I had, generally speaking, from my family and friends when I came out, a fairly positive reaction. But every person I came out to, I still had this fear that they were going to reject me. And so at least for like that first couple months, as I was kind of getting comfortable and, more and more comfortable in who I was and how I could show up in spaces. So sometimes when somebody comes out, once they finally share it, saying something, whatever, that's great, that's awesome, you're going to have a wonderful life, that's incredible, something that they're not expecting. They're expecting the worst, and then they're like, wait, what? You're proud of me? You're happy? Like, what is this? Like, and so I think that can kind of sometimes, help me like, oh, like, that's not what I was, like, can kind of help, like create a positive moment. If a student uses a term you're not familiar with, say, how can you help me? Can you tell me more? Can you tell me how that looks for you? If you want, or you can go Google it later. It's not necessarily the most important part sometimes. I think something that's important, so let's say a student comes out as queer, and if we're an older generation and queer was a word that was maybe used as a slur when we were younger, we don't say like, I don't really like that word. Could you use a different word? And so the reality is, right, that like, very rarely do we ever need to use somebody's identity when describing them to others. So you don't need to say, I'm Shawn, the gay guy from GLSEN, right? Like, like that's not the necessary descriptors that are needed in that dynamic. And so just having that part and just saying, let me know how I can support you. So in that initial interaction of a young person kind of seeks you as an adult, I think what Shanda was saying, they see you as safe. Somehow they see you as a safe person to start this conversation with, or a safer person. And that's an important distinction sometimes, like depending on that dynamic.
Shawn, can I add one more thing to this?
Please do.
I think it's very important to also add, thank you so much for telling me. Thank you so much for trusting me, something that feels authentic, because it's also this idea that we are acknowledging the gravity of what that person just did. And so I love all of these, but sometimes a very genuine understanding that they chose you for a reason. And when you can understand the gravity of it by saying, like, I really appreciate you telling me, that can do wonders for really validating that, they didn't just tell you that, what, hey, I think I'm going to try cornbread for the first time. No, they're saying to you, I've likely been holding this in for a really long time, and I chose you to share it with. And so I think we need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Couple quick things what not to say. I think sometimes like some things we kind of slip up. Oh, I knew it. So maybe your gender expression, Dar, was on point, and you had it. This is not about you in this moment. This is about centering the person who has seen you as a safe person to make sure their experience at this present moment is being supported. So I knew it. You can say it inside. You can give yourself a personal high five, pat on the back later. But in the moment, game face, trying to really stay present for the individual. Are you sure? This kind of gets to that phase we were talking about earlier. And so, everyone's at a journey. And so sometimes, like, I've worked with young people who come out and then, have come out as something else later on. And sometimes it can evolve. But I think more so at that moment of, thank you for sharing that. You're going to have a great life. Like, that's awesome. Something, whatever feels genuine to you. Are you sure? It's just a phase that will pass, is similar to the, are you sure? Kind of those pieces. Sometimes it's just not validating in that moment. You just haven't found a good woman or man yet. This is something that I think sometimes is said as like, you just need this. And again, it is really invalidating and insulting to assume that, because I think that's the important part too, is attraction. It can either be physical or emotional. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have had sex yet. But a lot of times people assume that you just haven't had that happen. Don't tell anyone. This is one that sometimes comes up when we fear maybe about a young person's safety in our school building. So it's coming from a good place. Like, I'm good, but I don't know about everyone else in this building. So sometimes there's that fear of like, that we don't want to tell others, but I think that again becomes invalidating, that it can add to the shame that young people might be feeling. Or again, like, just like you haven't found a good man, you can't be gay, you've had relationships with people of the opposite sex. And so just assuming that like people's dating history or experiences, like, that people show us a snapshot of who they are. And so making sure these pieces. I think the other piece too is, one other thing is sometimes in that initial time somebody's coming out, we want to jump into like kind of counselor mode and like really help them. Be like, I'm going to be your shepherd and kind of shepherd you through this process. I've got you. And then so we're like, have you told your parents? What other teachers have you told? Have you told your friends? And like, we start making this list, and that can ratchet that anxiety up of all the people I still have to tell, as opposed to, I now have one safe person I can talk to. Because if we start reminding them of all the other things, then we can potentially become a symbol of that dynamic. There's a lot of things on here. There's a couple Two things I really want to like point out on here, though. This is some of the things we talk about as best ways to support students. One is treat every student as unique. Every student is at a different place in their coming out journey. When I came out as gay, I really just needed support and validation from the people around me. For our trans or non-binary students, sometimes they might request different names, different pronouns, different restrooms, locker rooms, different uniforms, clothes, you know, like dress codes. There's all sorts of things that might come with that transition that we have to be sensitive to. So there are some really wonderful like gender transition tools that exist that can really be a conversation with the student. One reason we really recommend this is that if there's a point person at the school who can kind of work with the student around this, then they can communicate it. So we don't put the onus on a student, especially a high school student. Think about, they maybe have 8 classes they go to in a day. But they have to have this conversation with 8 different teachers, all in varying level of their competency around LGBT identities. And now we're putting it on the student that it's your job to, you know, educate all of your teachers, in addition to learning all your coursework and completing your homework and all the other things you do at school. So I think just that recognizing, if you know one gay student or one trans student, then you know one gay or trans student. And the next one is not going to have the same, maybe always the pathway. The other piece I think that is really important is this phrase, weird, not wrong. And I think it's a phrase that I think about a lot, is that if a student comes out to me or shares something with me about like, you know, how they're navigating the coming out process or things, if it is not something that is causing harm to themselves or causing harms to others, then it might be weird to me, but it is not wrong. And so I think sometimes allowing ourselves to not be in a place of judgment of others and really allowing that space. I think the other piece, just like we said in the coming out, don't say I knew it, because it's not about us. You know, that like if a child asks for a different name or a student asks for a different name or different pronouns, really work on what we can do to show up and support them as best as possible. Because, you know, so like one parent told me that when their child came out, they started doing a thing that every time they folded laundry, they were like, this is his shirt. These are his shorts. Like, and so they started using the pronoun just over and over and over again, just to try and retrain their brain. So it's a small thing that if you have a trans student in your class, it could be, this is her paper, or this is their paper, this is his paper, whatever their pronouns are, so that we are really trying to be responsive and you know, recognizing that, because to use the wrong pronouns or a wrong name can sometimes make a student feel unsafe in a space because they don't see themselves reflected. So these are a few kind of a few pieces just to kind of add about what to do in terms of coming out, and some like general strategies that we can take into account. So Shanda, any other thoughts before we can open it up to some general questions?
I think questions would be good.
Cool. So we're happy to take questions. You can put it in the chat, come off mute. There's other questions or thoughts you have around this process? While you are thinking of a question, I have one I want to ask Shanda if there's nothing that's coming up. So Shanda, so there's a lot of work around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and the initial ACEs study looked a lot at abuse and neglect. But there's been, like the Philadelphia ACEs study is one that was an expanded ACEs that looked a little bit more at like the coming out process and different things as like, or, being on the receiving end of racism or other discrimination is sometimes being in that. And so just in your experience, in doing trauma work and like, how do some of these other identity-based pieces that weren't in the original ACEs study, but there's been some advancing research maybe play out or inform our understanding?
Thank you. Good question. I'm so excited that they did expand it because it wasn't giving us a complete picture. So even as of, I think earlier this year, the CDC had an ACEs pyramid, pretty much that had adverse childhood experiences at the base. And pretty much if they have adverse childhood experiences, it interrupts brain development. And if we have brain development, it leads to, social and cognitive impairments, which leads to behaviors that try to alleviate that or compensate for that, which are high risk, blah, 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 all the way up to early death. What they have done now is they've added 2 columns underneath adverse childhood experiences. And the base of that pyramid is now historical or embodied trauma or experiences that are negative experiences that have happened, which then leads to social conditions. Then that leads to adverse childhood experiences. And so in that, what we start to see is the historical embodied nature of trauma is kind of at the base of the social conditions that exist that then lead to these experiences. And so, yes. And so what we are trying to understand, particularly in this, is by the time this child is born and they start to get messages about who they are, what's acceptable and not acceptable through media, through the family talking, through religious expectations and all these various things, they're already deeply rooted in their community. They're already deeply rooted in the culture. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that people can now start to understand, that it really does go further and deeper than just the thing the child overheard when they were born. In addition to this, epigenetically, we pass things down as well. How we cope and deal with stress and all of these different things play into how a person shows up in the world. And that's going to be really important as they navigate kind of the coming out process.
Awesome. Thanks, Jalen. Jalen asked in the chat, when a student describes wanting to come out to multiple teachers but has difficulty doing so, how could school counselors help this process? Is a seminar speaker too broad, or one-on-one sessions, school counselor and teacher be better? Yeah, wonderful question. So a couple things I'll just share is one, every teacher and every adult in the building, right, is going to sometimes have different skills that students see them for. So there's some students who maybe come from like a lower socioeconomic status, for instance, that sometimes build relationships with individuals who aren't classroom teachers, but might be maintenance or cafeteria workers or different things, because those individuals speak, act more like family members that they're comfortable or familiar with, so they could more relate to them. So I think there's that recognition. So one of the things we talk about in schools is the power of the handoff. And the idea is, if a student comes to me and I am uncomfortable, maybe, comes out to me, or is like trying to come out to me as an LGBT, or somewhere on the LGBTQ continuum, and that's just not my area of expertise. I might, just because I see her on the screen here, Liz, I might say, I know Liz just went to a training. Do you feel comfortable if you and I go down to Liz's room and talk with Liz? Because I think she's got some resources on this. So when we've asked for consent from the student, we've not just passed them off. It's not just been like, oop, not it. Like, keep it moving. Like, but we have validated the student, said like, thank you. Even if individuals aren't personally comfortable with LGBT issues or feel competent, that we can still show up for a student and say, thank you for sharing that. I just got to be honest, this is not my area of expertise. I don't have as many resources as I would like, but I know Liz does. Can we go talk to her and walk with a student and make sure that there's a handoff, so that the student doesn't feel that they've been pushed off, but that they feel like they've been connected throughout this process. So I think that's one thing a school counselor could really do, is help assist with that. I think the other piece, I was at a training one time and one teacher talked about a student who had transitioned, and another teacher was like, I have that student in my same class and they've never said anything to me about transitioning. And it was like, oh, so the student might not have seen that other teacher as a safe individual. And so, and that sometimes too is if a school counselor has a one-on-one conversation or a relationship with the student, it might say, like, to help facilitate this, what information do you feel comfortable sharing with your teachers? Or would you like your teachers to know to support you? So that they don't have to have those conversations, that they could have those pieces. If staff, once they find out that they have, I think something that sometimes happens is we do free trainings at GLSEN and things, but sometimes a staff member will be like, oh, I have a trans student or a gender nonconforming student or non-binary student in my class. Like, that's not something I'm sure how to navigate. Sometimes I might ask or reach out for resources, and that could be either one-on-one or might say, like, this could benefit the team, team of teachers that this student has. So I think oftentimes though, I think the best strategy is to ask the student how they want to navigate and what they would like to see happen in that process. And then we as adults help them to kind of achieve, so that they feel in control of who knows and when they know, because confidentiality, I think, is a really important piece to building that relationship.
I also just want to add one part of how we approach it says a lot. Is it a walk to the guillotine? Oh, no, okay, well, who we got to call? Or is it a celebration? Oh my God, awesome. Okay, how can I support you? Our word choice, our tone of voice, our facial expression, how we literally are engaging with them in the moment can make or break that moment. And believe me, it's a moment they're not going to forget either way. Okay. So we want them to truly be able to realize that you gave them a congratulations, even if it's not your field of expertise. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Okay, and then moving into what Shawn is saying. But when we kind of start off with the kind of thing, it's not good.
Any other questions? Awesome. Well, we really thank you, Shanda, for spending time with us. It's always good to see. We don't get to hang out as much now in the pandemic, but that is. But it's always good to see you, and we appreciate you all joining us. As I said, GLSEN, we're happy to do trainings in schools or provide resources if there's other things that are coming up to support students. I think one thing, our last session last week, Nikki, who's on the call, as well as Dan Lai, talked about the mental health of students. And I think that's just something as well to maintain on our radar, just because right now with COVID, there's a lot of isolation from a lot of our students. And so they sometimes don't feel comfortable talking, or, because in a classroom setting, they could maybe steal a moment with the teacher. But if I'm only showing up to Zoom calls or, online virtual calls to my teacher, it's a little difficult to do a one-on-one and kind of let them know what's going on. So, so finding some of those ways, whatever it might be, whether it's office hours or emails or things that allow a little bit of connection, can help, especially right now, just as we navigate this pandemic.
One other thing, Shawn, I just thought when you said that too, is that if their parents are working from home, they may then also not feel comfortable talking in front of their parents with their teacher too. So that might be something else that they need to navigate.
Right, like allowing for email or chat can be a really great way so students don't have to say it out loud if they feel like they need to reach out. So cool. Awesome. So thank you all so much. If you're able to join us on Monday to kick off Solidarity Week, we'll be sending out the link and the details for that probably on Friday or Sunday when I get to that. And then if there's any other colleagues that would like to join, they can still register. So thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Bye.